Mental representation of languages. In this module, we will explore two broad questions. The first question is whether the languages are differently organized and processed by the minds of the brains of the bilingualists. Number two, does the brain of the bilinguals function differently or similarly to the monolinguals? Now, coming to the first question regarding how is language represented and processed. In a majority of right-handed people, whether they are monolinguals or whether they are bilinguals, it is the left hemisphere of the brain that is actively involved in all sorts of language learning, particularly so if a person is right-handed. So what we are saying is that in all right-handed people, there is a likelihood that it is the left brain or left hemisphere of the brain that is involved in language learning. If it does not happen that way, then it is an exception. Now, the same is true of the bilinguals also. However, it has been viewed that in adult L2 learning, that is, if a person beyond the age of 18 opts to learn a second language, then the right hemisphere of the brain may be more actively engaged than the left hemisphere of the brain. However, over the time, as the proficiency level of the adult increases, the right hemisphere somehow reduces its work, and it is the left hemisphere of the brain again that takes over the job of language learning and language processing. So what we are saying over here is that, talking broadly, the differences between monolinguals and bilinguals are an exception rather than a rule. So, more often than not, it is the same left hemisphere of the brain that is involved in the learning of a language, whether it is the first language or the second language. Now we come to language processing as such. How is language processing and, of course, representation, how are they present in the mind of the bilingual? How do they work? So there has been research which provides some evidence that the storage in the brains for the languages are both separate, and yet there is one shared storage in the brain where what we say or what we would like to call some general conceptual framework is at work. So there are both storage which is different for each language, and yet they share one shared space in the brain also. Now, there is a strong interconnection between all these storage spaces, and the more proficient a person is, the more quickly the associations trigger one language or the other one. So the question might be, what is it that this shared space comprises of? This shared space comprises of associations which might be similar, some common images, some translation, something that is shared by the languages themselves, or some memory triggers in one component of the language that might signify a similar component in the other language. So as we said, with acquisition stage, depending on the strength of language learning, the directness of interconnections between different these storage boxes will be affected. So the higher the proficiency is, the more direct the connection between the storage box and a language that you would like to use is. If your proficiency level is lower in that language, then the learner will actually, beginning from that shared conceptual box, will move back to the first language and then again move back to the second language for a similar component of language.